Chapter 4, Time to Mind Your Own Business. Evening of Day 1, Time stands still sticking. When considering the Knights of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, there are usually several different opinions. Parents likely think that their children are nestled snugly in their dorm rooms, resting up for another day of magical education. Parents are, of course, the most deluded about their children's lives. No matter how close a relationship a parent and child may have, children will, out of kindness, shield their parents from the truth. It is a time-honored practice, one of great history and tradition, even in cases on time travel, when said parents are the same age as said child. Well, lying is always the best policy. The students themselves might consider the evenings as prime time to enjoy themselves without teacher interference. Various Muggle and Wizard games are played late into the night, and among the upper form students are busy trying to arrange romantic rendezvous. Love, it seems, can endure even on weeknights when a half-meter essay is due the next day. And despite some people's, McGonagall, arguments that closed classrooms should be securely locked and the astronomy tower patrolled, other people, Dumbledore, seem content to trust the students and allow them to make their own choices. Teachers, depending on their attitudes, generally spend their evenings ignoring the exploits of the students, or frantically trying to stop said exploits. The caretaker, a squib by the name of Argus Filch, was constantly at war with the little miscreants that roamed his halls after curfew. He had taken the job 10 years ago and during that period had stumbled upon more future married couples than he would like, even if they would later be married to people other than those he'd found them with. And it did provide some interesting blackmail. Was he the sort to pursue such things? Or if he owned a camera? That particular night the man had managed to snag Sirius Black and a girl named Matilda Wells. It had, in fact, been a complete accident. The caretaker had been looking for a broom when he'd stumbled upon the pair. Despite the lack of intention, Filch would go to sleep that night with a toothy smile, glad to have, at the very least, upset Mr. Black's plans. That little bastard made more messes in his halls in a month than most students made in their lives. For the students' court, the usual punishment involved a firm lecture by their head of house and removal of house points. Thus the heads of Gryffindor and Hufflepuff gathered in Professor McGonagall's office. The Gryffindor head was as strict and stern as ever. She paced about her office using phrases like disregard for rule, matters of propriety, and foolish, juvenile behavior. Professor Pod didn't seem to understand what had been going on and seemed willing to believe that the pair had gotten locked in there while looking for some cleaning products to tidy their common rooms. He mentioned twice the fact that he needed to return to trimming his moustache bush and couldn't understand what the fuss was about. Professor McGonagall was not so easily fooled. She continued pacing and lecturing. Professor Pod nodded at the right moments and hummed at the wrong ones. Sirius managed to listen to her lecture with practiced ease, and Miss Wells turned as red as a tomato. And to bed this instant. The Transfiguration Professor finished, shooing them out of her office. Sirius smirked. That's just where I'm headed, Professor, he said with a wink. Night, Professor, an embarrassed Miss Wells said, quickly heading to her own common room. Professor Pod followed after her, seeming untroubled. Sirius grinned once more at his head of house before she slammed her door on his face. Sirius casually strolled through the halls, not in much rush despite the hour. When he finally did arrive in the common room, it was half empty. Some students had already retired to bed, but his friends could always be counted upon. How many points did you lose this time? Remus casually inquired. The werewolf was reading his Transfiguration text and didn't bother looking up as Sirius sat down. How'd you know? Sirius couldn't help but ask. You never return this early unless you were caught, Remus provided. The prankster shrugged. Only 10 points. Completely worth it. James was staring into space and hadn't made any comment on his best mate's entrance. James. Hey buddy, you're gonna burn a hole in the carpet. Sirius waved a palm before the young man's face, bringing him back to the present. Hey Sirius, you make any more progress? He didn't sound very interested, but Sirius decided to let the lack of enthusiasm slide. Not much, got caught by Filch. Sirius watched as his friend quickly went back to staring. What's the matter with you? You still mad at Tempest? Huh? James asked. No, I think we might have misjudged him. He isn't a bad bloke. Not a ball of laughs, but, hey, he didn't tell the teachers on you about the acromantulas. Maybe he isn't too bad. Sirius's eyes opened wide. What is up with you? He reached across and shook his friend's shoulder. What? I'm not saying we'll be friends or anything. Just he's not that bad. What do you think, Remus? James turned to the prefect and ignored Sirius's gaping expression. He seems nice enough, Remus was happy to say. In truth, he rather liked the new transfer student. It was rare for anyone to be so open-minded about his condition. Not that he would go out of his way to upset his friends with the matter. Yeah, that is what I thought. James's face became thoughtful again. Anyway, he said he isn't interested in Lily, so. Sirius smacked his head. I should have known that you'd give up once you knew your Lily Flower's virtue was protected. Hey, James complained, that's not all. I said he didn't turn you into the professor's. Isn't that enough to give him another chance? He considered telling him about Tempest's parents, but that didn't seem like the thing to share, and if it were him he wouldn't want people being nice to him out of pity. James. He defended the Slytherins and he took your wand, don't you remember that? Sirius fumed, his clenching at his sides. Yeah. Well, you did prank them first and it's not like he didn't give our wands back. James rubbed the back of his neck self-consciously, and he said he was sorry about it. Sirius leaned back in the chair, allowing his head to lie weakly against the cushion. Tell me I'm not hearing this. He waved his hands at the other around him. In the space of a few hours you've all decided to turn into a bunch of pansies. He's a prat, he invaded our dorm and he's gonna ruin everything. What's gonna happen when the next full moon comes? Won't he think it's odd that we all leave the dorm? Maybe he won't notice, Peter suggested softly. He went to sleep real early tonight. I don't think he'll care, Remus voiced from behind his book. What do you mean by that, if he finds out? Sirius let the conversation hang ominously. Everyone knew of Remus's paranoia regarding anyone finding out his secret. He'd nearly had a heart attack when the other three had confronted him about it. He said he already has a friend that, has the same thing as me. Remus was always careful never to say the W word in the presence of others. It was this sort of precaution that had allowed him to remain undiscovered for 6 years. Really? James inquired curiously. He leaned towards the werewolf. What did he say about it? Not much. He and Lily were talking about it. Just said his friend was just like any other guy. Everyone could tell that Remus was pleased with that comment, perhaps even more so because it was an inadvertent compliment. They all tried to tell Remus that it was fine, but their friendship and loyalty to him made him question it. Having another person offer his opinion meant more than Harry Tempest could know. Come on, Sirius argued in a pleading way, don't you find that odd? Tempest just happens to get into a conversation about, right when you're there. He was probably trying to get you to like him. How could that be? James protested. Tempest doesn't even know about Remus's little problem. Remus remained silent about the dispute. He believed that Tempest spoke the truth, and that was all that mattered really. What's up with you, Padfoot? Why are you so determined to hate him? James ran a hand through his hair and gave his friend a questioning look. He's a stuck-up prat, Sirius pressed on. He's a little snake and I know it. James shook his head. What happened this summer, mate? The undeclared leader of the Marauders suddenly looked serious and his voice was softer. What does that have? Nothing. Just summer. Sirius rose to his feet. I'm going to bed, he announced, heading for the staircase before anyone could call him back. James turned to Remus. I think it must have been pretty bad, he said softly. He came over for 2 weeks near the end. He said he was bored. Now I wonder. James rubbed his temples tiredly. I should have noticed, he said aloud without looking at anyone. Noticed what? Peter asked, leaning forward. He was trying too hard to be himself. Neither Peter nor Remus commented on that. Instead, the other three continued their homework, Peter asking questions whenever he got stuck. When James grew bored, he found himself switching between watching Lily, who was sitting alone and doing her own homework, and glancing at the stairs, worrying about what was happening with Sirius and why the stubborn pure blood refused to tell them. Sirius was feeling rebellious and didn't brush his teeth before falling into bed. He glared at the one bed with closed curtains. An unreasonable voice kept saying that Harry Tempest was to blame for unsettling everything. Just the change of an additional bed in the dorm seemed to piss him off. He lay in his bed, allowing his anger to melt away, leaving him feeling somewhat cold. Day 2. And we begin to wonder what mistakes we made in past lives. Harry awoke the next morning not feeling as refreshed as he should. His dreams had been troubled. Too hazy for them to be real visions, but Harry had the vaguest feeling that he had been a subconscious visitor to the Dark Lord's mind, not a place he wanted to be. And he was still as rubbish at occlumency as ever. He yawned and rubbed the back of his head. Looking around the dorm room, he at first felt a little startled to see the unfamiliar aspects. Dean's Muggle posters were nowhere in sight. Instead he saw a row of moving wizarding pictures. Ron's bed was occupied by a blonde head that still snored slightly. Harry had to shake the cotton out of his skull to remember where he was. "We don't have many classes today," a quiet voice intruded. Harry turned around to find his favorite defense professor already dressed and appropriately enough reading a defense text. "You're up early," Harry mentioned. "You too?" "Usually I have to pry the others up with a crowbar." Harry nodded and yawned. He crossed the room to take a better look at the book Remus was reading. "Defense for the Diligent, sounds interesting." He spoke without irony. "Yeah." Remus's eyes looked away from the bruises on Harry's chest. "James said you like defense." "Yeah, my favorite, you." Harry moved back to his bed and dug into his chest, finding a clean uniform. "It's all right," Remus admitted. "What's the professor like?" Harry asked. He'd had his share of terrible defense professors. Not to mention a killer or two. "Haven't met him yet," Remus stated. "First class is today. From what I've heard through, he was an Auror. The other classes seem impressed, but considering we had an utter incompetent last year." "Well, it wasn't too difficult to be better." Harry nodded in understanding. A half hour later Harry was showered and dressed for the day. Remus had also managed to wake James and Sirius, and only Peter still avoided being awoken. Harry knew what he'd like to do to get the rat out of bed. But he'd just patched things up with his father and didn't think bodily harming James's friend would improve matters. Harry gave Remus a commiserating look as the poor prefect tried once again to shake Peter awake. He decided to grab his bag and head to breakfast. Perhaps he could have a few moments to center himself, clear his thoughts, and take stock of his magical indicators. All these had been suggestion from Madame Pomfrey and Professor Dumbledore. Harry, quite frankly, thought them all to be a load of dung. But he could use some time with his parents out of his sight. Spotting him every time he turned around was making him feel a little jumpy. "Harry," a voice intruded in his thoughts. He very nearly sighed in annoyance. "Lily, didn't see you there," he greeted with little enthusiasm. "I was getting worried that you hadn't woken up yet," the prefect said as she guided Harry toward the common room exit. "Oh yeah, no trouble there." Harry reluctantly followed the red-haired witch. "It would be just like Remus to not make sure you woke up in time." As if anyone could sleep through his attempts to wake Peter, Harry muttered. Once again Lily led him to the Great Hall, telling him about Hogwarts history as they walked. Harry was starting to think that Lily took her job as prefect too seriously. Surely McGonagall hadn't expected her to shadow him everywhere and provide a guided tour of the school. The two settled themselves at the Gryffindor table, Lily continuing to lecture on about the ceiling and the other aspects of the room. Harry found he became less annoyed as he watched her rather than listened. "We have Transfiguration today, did you do the reading last night?" Lily helped herself to toast as she questioned him. Harry shrugged. Yeah," he lied. Although perhaps it wasn't a lie. In his time McGonagall had chosen a newer text, but he highly doubted that she had varied things too greatly. And he didn't really care if she had. Lily considered him suspiciously, but didn't comment. "So where is Alice today?" he asked conversationally. "She and Frank are taking a walk." Or something like that. The redhead seemed a little sad as she said it. Harry began to see why Lily might be sticking with him so diligently. Harry looked at the table but couldn't find anything that appealed to him. There was an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach that made eating anything sound nauseating. He could read the signs well enough but for the moment decided to ignore it. He stared at the empty plate trying to focus on the shine of the gold and pushed his magic back in line. Someone sitting down across from him broke his gaze. "Morning," James Potter said. He eagerly helped himself to eggs and sausage. "What are you doing?" Lily demanded, staring at James as if the young man had grown a second head. James swallowed. "Eating breakfast." He flashed the prefect a cocky grin that set her spluttering. "I mean, what are you doing sitting by me?" she demanded. Sirius sat down beside his friend, mostly out of habit. He didn't pay much mind to Tempest, still feeling a little tired to begin another argument. "She's got a point, James. I think McGonagall banned close proximity after that food fight in 4th year. I didn't start that if you recall," James pointed out. He somehow managed to avoid Lily's harsh glare. Anyway, I'm not sitting with Evans, I just want to catch up with our new roommate. If she's sitting next to him, well, it's not my problem. Lily seemed to decide to ignore him, eating her breakfast and moving a little further down the bench and away from him. So, how'd you sleep? James asked loudly. Harry wasn't certain exactly who the question was directed to, him or Lily, but judging by Lily's tight-lipped stare he drove forward. Fine, you? All right, had to stay up to read that awful Transfiguration homework. Utter rubbish. What do you mean rubbish, Potter? Lily demanded, breaking her vow of silence. It just rehashed everything she said in class, pointless waste of time, proclaimed James with a finality in his voice. Don't you think the warnings were well advised? Some of these human transfigurations can result in lifelong mutations. Lily leaned forward and tapped the table in a firm way when she was finished speaking. Only if you're an idiot, James said under his breath. Lily's eyes burned in annoyance. Just because, Harry quickly broke in. Transfiguration must be your best subject, huh? James cast a glance in Harry's direction. Yeah, well, I guess. I'm good at quite a few. And modest too, Sirius added before cramming more food into his mouth. You're insufferable, Lily pronounced. James shrugged. You've used that one before, James pointed out tiredly. I'll see you in class, Lily said to Harry before grabbing her book bag and leaving the table. Harry turned to his father with a curious look. So, were you trying to drive her away? He asked. That's just how it goes, Sirius said stiffly. He avoided looking at Harry and turned to his breakfast and James, attempting to shut the newcomer out of the conversation. So another stirring performance, prongs, he said with a cheeky grin. James grabbed a piece of toast and bit into it angrily. I just can't get around her, he fumed, speaking more to himself than anyone around. James, what can I say? She's a prude with no sense of humor. You're better off dropping her and moving on to someone else. The canine animagus grinned and patted his friend's back in a cheerful manner. James shrugged him away. No, there's something about her. Harry didn't know what advice to offer. Girls were something he'd never quite understood. Maybe if Hermione was here she could explain the problem between James and Lily. Not that he would probably understand the explanation. There was little comfort in knowing that Ron would be even more clueless. If Harry were to consider it, under pain of death mind you, he might conclude that James still had the maturity level of a 12-year-old, and as such his humor didn't appeal to the serious young witch. In the same way it could be said that Lily's determination to see the worst in James often lead her to miss out on the man's more worthy attributes. Both caught up in their own problems and ideas, both stubborn and opinionated. In other words, they were 16. Harry, while also 16, had some difficulty getting too involved in this angst-filled drama they were concocting. After facing the sort of challenges that had come his way, these small problems were hard to relate to. And, he did know the future. Remus and Peter also ambled over. The blonde settled into his seat, helping himself to cereal only to stop dead when he spotted Harry Tempest sitting by them. He nudged Sirius. Why are we sitting by him? He asked quietly. James was just using the new kid to sit next to Lily. Sirius replied not quite as quietly. Remus's eyes closed for a brief moment, but when he opened them he found Tempest didn't seem troubled at all. Although he wasn't eating, James seemed to notice this too. Don't you eat? He asked. Remus remembered the boy's sugar-filled meal the evening before. Not hungry, Harry stated with a grimace. He did snag some orange juice though. What's the day today? He asked. The 3rd, Remus provided. No. The day? What day is it? Monday, Tuesday. There was an oddly hopeful tone when he said the word Tuesday. Harry tried to think back, but with the whole time travel thing it was hard to figure out. And he hadn't bothered yesterday. Thursday, Remus answered, looking at the others with a little confusion. Crap, Harry said aloud. Absolute rubbish. He took a gulp of juice, banging the glass forcefully down onto the table. Well, I'm off to class. Sending the 4 marauders a wry grin before turning and leaving for the Transfiguration classroom. That's one weird bloke, Sirius commented. He ate his eggs with a frown. Maybe a little, James allowed. But see, he isn't bad. Sirius's expression grew a little darker. Yeah, sure, whatever you say. James gave his best mate a glance before shaking his head and continuing his breakfast. Remus also looked closer at Sirius, but as with James he chose to say nothing. Peter, who had been sitting next to Sirius, still wasn't sure why they now talking to Harry Tempest, but merely decided to not make an issue out of it. Whatever James and Sirius did were fine by him. Blueberry muffins. Class, Remus said suddenly. As if to highlight his statement, a bell chimed. Great, we're gonna be late. The three quickly got to their feet, Sirius grabbing Peter by the shoulders. My muffin, the boy complained. Come on, Sirius said. I'm not taking Transfiguration, the chubby boy added. Sirius dropped his arms. Oh. See you, Pete. The blonde found himself alone at the table. He felt very exposed, being the only marauder in sight. A pair of Slytherins glared at him in a menacing manner. Peter chose to take his muffin and go. He had an hour before divination, but he'd rather wait in the common room. When Transfiguration was over, Harry left the class with the feeling of dread. And it wasn't homework that was deadening his mood. The class had gone well. They'd been transfiguring their fingers into claws. Harry's ability had impressed the professor to even offer him a slight smile. James Potter and Sirius Black had also managed it by the end of the class. And both Remus and Lily, as well as a few of their other classmates, became very close, so it didn't seem too unusual. But for Harry, the success left him ill at ease, because he hadn't intended to do well. While he had learned the spell a few weeks ago in his own time, indeed from the very same professor, he had purposely not focused on the magic as much as he should. He had no intention of making a show of himself. The incident in Care of Magical Creatures and his argument with the Marauders were more than enough to spark interest, and he had hoped to glide through the rest of his time in the past with little comment. So he decided to match his classmates and not produce a stir. Thus it was with some surprise that his lackluster effort produced a perfect example of human transfiguration. On the first try, Harry had tried to shrug the display off, had desperately tried to quiet Lily's gush of excitement. Unfortunately, by the time he'd managed it, Professor McGonagall had already approached, and Harry's talent had earned him 10 points. But it gave Harry no satisfaction. His stomach was twisting into knots and an uncomfortable warmth was growing in his chest. He headed to defense with the feeling that the other shoe was about to drop. And it was a Thursday. Ill omens indeed. That phrase had come from divination, proving that the class wasn't entirely pointless. I'm sorry I doubted you, Lily said. You didn't seem to take class seriously the other day. She smiled in a fond way as she walked with him to defense class. It's not a big deal, Harry muttered. Well, I think it's impressive. Lily continued walking beside him, occasionally glancing at him in a curious way. Are you all right? She asked. Yeah, Harry answered, looking ahead. He was getting tired of people asking him that. Lily grew quiet, which seemed to be all James needed. Do you really think it's impressive? He asked, leaning towards her, flashing his hand of perfect claws. Lily turned with raised eyebrows. It's a good piece of magic, she said with a firm voice. James stopped dead, then quickly moved to catch up. Really, I didn't think you cared for Transfiguration, he stated seriously. It's not that I don't like it, I just like charms more. Oh, well, if you want me to tutor you. James raised an eyebrow and grinned. I'll help you anytime. I don't need you, Lily snarled, picking up her pace. 2 minutes without her yelling at you. Impressive, Sirius said to James. You guys are almost ready to get married. James ruffled his hair. Come on, let's get to class. Remus had trailed behind and found himself walking next to Harry. Tempus was walking in a somewhat dazed manner, a thoughtful frown on his face. You all right? Remus asked. I just told you, I'm... Oh, Remus. Harry looked up and spotted Lily's quick figure a few feet ahead of him. He scratched the topic of his head, a mannerism that made him look more like James. Yeah, I'm fine. Class went well, the werewolf said. Yeah. Soon everyone had arrived at the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. Harry found himself sitting down and examining how the class was arranged. Long practice with many defense professors had taught him that one could usually determine a teacher's potential based on how the room was arranged. Lupin's room had been filled with interesting creatures but was otherwise neat and practical. Lockhart's room was exhibition of ego gratification. Moody's collection of paranoid dark detectors had also been a clue. This room was clean but empty of all personal touches. An oak desk with only a silver inkwell on the surface. The student desks were all pushed back, leaving a large open space at the front of the classroom. Harry wondered what the professor intended for that. The class seemed empty. Gryffindors and Slytherins were present, but Ravenclaw and Hufflepuffs were in short supply. Indeed, less than 20 students had passed on to Newt-level defense. He hoped that there was another class, Perhaps there were two sixth-year groups broken up based of scheduling, but Harry couldn't help but wonder if this was more of influence that Voldemort's war was leaving. Harry was beginning to see what Arthur Weasley had spoke of. The wizarding world was dividing. Light side, dark side, and those who wanted to pretend that nothing was happening. Although Harry knew that house wasn't really a good indication of which side the people in him might choose. "Good afternoon, class," a deep voice said, its owner entering and closing the door with a snap. The new defense professor was a stocky man, short but strong. He had wavy black hair that was cut at his chin. His face was clean shaven, but his eyebrows were thick and his dark eyes were sunken into his face. His sweeping blue robes did inspire the look of an Auror, as did his march-like way of entering. "I'm Professor Barton." The man swept to his desk and seated himself abruptly. Harry noticed that the man's firm presence was more than enough to silence the class. "I'm familiar with the previous professors you've had and their failure to handle certain subjects. As such, this year we will be focusing on the damage wizards can do to each other and how to protect against it. That is particularly important in these times." Professor Barton stood from his desk and swept through the classroom, seeming to be assessing the students before him. The man paused before Harry for a moment, their eyes meeting before the man moved on. "You are Newt-level students, and I don't believe in treating young adults like children. So today we are diving into some of the most dangerous magic, and I will guide you in how to best protect yourself." Harry found himself tensing. There are 3 curses that the Ministry has deemed unforgivable. The use of any of these earns the caster a life term in Azkaban. "Can anyone tell me these curses?" Remus's hand rose in the air. "Imperius," he said in his textbook voice. "Explain," Professor Barton said. He surveyed Remus with chilly eyes. He stuttered a bit in the beginning. "The Imperius curse is said to take over the will of the individuals, making them do whatever is asked of them. Complete control." The werewolf seemed to shiver a bit at the idea but quickly hid any anxiety. "Correct," the Auror responded. This was the place where a professor would usually assign points. Professor Barton did not. Instead he made a small note on a piece of parchment. "Next curse," he called out. A Ravenclaw with curly hair raised his hand, the palm straight as an arrow. "The Cruciatus curse," he said without being called on. "It is a torture curse that inflicts pain upon the victim." "Yes, Mr. Barton raised an eyebrow. "Denton," the Ravenclaw replied. Professor Barton made another note on his parchment. "And the final curse?" he asked, scanning the class. Everyone seemed determined not to meet his eye. "Come now, the final one, the ticker. How about?" He scanned the class list, landing on his target. "Mr. Tempus, the final unforgivable curse, please." Harry met the man's stony eyes with no expression. "Avada Kedavra, the killing curse." "Explain," Barton asked silkily. Harry's lips tightened a small degree, but otherwise he showed no outward sign of dissent. "It's a curse that kills," he replied simply. "Any other information you'd like to supply your class?" "Yeah, if you see a big green light coming your way, duck. It can't be blocked." Harry fought the urge to glare at the man and strove to keep his face impassive. "Correct, Mr. Tempus," Barton said softly. "Very good advice." The man made a little longer note on his parchment, finally looking up to meet the stares of his silent class. "Today we will be exploring only one of these curses, the other 2 in your next 2 classes. In between I'd like you to read as much as you can on them. They are featured heavily in Chapter 6 of your text, but considering the Hogwarts library is without compare, I'd also like you to find a second source of information. 1-foot essay covering them and the Ministry's history with these curses." People had hastily made a note of the assignment. "Now, today we'll be focusing on the Imperius curse. As Mr. Lupin explained, it exerts total control over the person it has been cast upon. However, unlike the other 2, this curse can be broken if the individual has a strong enough will. To that end I have been given permission by the Ministry and the headmaster to cast it upon you." Here the class burst into noise, but Barton ignored them all and plowed forward. "That you can understand the feeling involved. Hopefully should you ever encounter it in real life you will have the means to stop it before you are forced to do something you may regret. Some of the worst crimes and betrayals have occurred because individuals were under this curse." The class continued to mutter to itself, but no one made a move to rise from their chairs. "I'll be calling you up in alphabetical order. Starting with Black, Sirius." The young pure blood rose to his feet a little stiffly, but his cocky walk to the front of the classroom was in character. He grinned at the professor, silently encouraging the former Auror to give it his best shot. In less than a minute Sirius was happily singing Mary Had a Little Lamb and skipping like a schoolgirl. Although admittedly his movements seemed a little jerky. Not too shabby, Mr. Black, Barton mentioned, making a note on his paper again. You managed to fight for 50 seconds, which is more than most. Sirius didn't seem too pleased with the compliment. His face had gone pale and he sat back in his chair, avoiding everyone and staring at his hands. The class continued on. Lily, with her stubborn streak, also put up a good fight but eventually pretended to skip rope without complaint. Remus seemed terribly nervous at the idea of having his will cast aside, on a night other than the full moon, but didn't seem to put up any struggle when Barton ordered him to tap dance, a rather extravagant dance number. None of the other students seemed to put up much of a fight either. Alice had docilely clucked like a chicken, and another Gryffindor girl, whom Harry remembered from Care of Magical Creatures, danced the hula. One Slytherin, that had some resemblance to Millicent Bulstrode, eagerly imitated a sheep. Harry, admittedly, was looking forward to his father's turn, but wound up a little disappointed. James didn't display any natural ability at fighting the curse. Almost as soon as the spell was cast he was reciting Shakespeare, the role of Romeo, interestingly enough. But Harry would admit to a little happiness in seeing Severus Snape dance a jig and sing an Irish drinking song, with accent. While the man might become a master occlumens, his teenage self couldn't battle the imperious curse. Another student by the name of Stuart Benton declared loudly, after his failure, that no one could ever break such a curse. Barton laughed. It can indeed be done, but as I said, it takes an individual of very strong will. And on that note, it was Harry's turn. As soon as Barton said the name Tempus, Harry had a bad feeling about it. He wasn't terribly worried about breaking the curse. He could probably explain that away. After all, he'd managed it in his 4th year as well. But he had a nagging feeling that playing around with powerful dark magic wasn't the best idea at the moment. Barton was getting ready to cast. Wait, Professor, Harry said a little weakly. I'm not certain this is a good idea. Barton paused. And why would you think that, Mr. Tempus? Your other classmates haven't minded. Surely you aren't worried I'll make too much of a fool of you? A few snickers from the back made Harry feel a little angry, but not enough to lash out as he might have years ago. No, I'm just... Well, I just wanted to warn you, I guess. Harry finished lamely. Even he didn't know why this seemed like a bad idea. It would be troublesome if it was discovered he could easily throw off, or unforgivable, but it wouldn't be too difficult to blame it on a previous lesson from Spellix. Warn me, Barton scoffed. Prepare yourself, Mr. Tempus. Imperio. The curse zoomed towards him and Harry instantly felt the familiar calming effect he attributed with it. All his cares and worries were gone. But they weren't. A strong voice in the back of his head seemed to read off a litany of all his current problems and how easily things could spew into chaos. A small voice seemed to be saying something, but Harry could barely hear it. Instead, a wash of his own mind seemed to flood him for a moment. He needed to end this. This had to end. End it. Now. The class watched in stunned silence as Professor Barton was tossed violently across the room. He smacked into a wall with a hard thud. The magical pressure seemed to hold him in place for a moment before he felt the imperious curse crumble away. Then the magic was gone and he crumpled to his knees weakly. Harry stood still as a post for a moment before his green eyes opened and he took in his professor collapsed on the floor. He slowly approached, looking very nervous. I'm sorry, Professor, are you all right? Professor Barton wheezed on the floor. Harry turned to his classmates. No one seemed to have moved. A few mouths hung open and several eyes had opened wide, but most just stared at Harry in dull shock. Maybe someone should get Madame Pomfrey, Harry suggested. Lily could be counted upon to snap out of her daze. Yeah, I'll go. She climbed to her feet and hurried out the door, her robe swinging behind her, and she jogged. Harry turned back to the professor and rested a hand on the man's shoulder. I'm sorry, sir, he said softly. Barton's odd empty-looking eyes managed to look up at him, an expression that seemed to be mixed with a little fear. Harry stood back a bit, not sure how he allayed the man's concern. A few other students were approaching now, all careful not to get too close to Harry. You actually broke it, Sirius said aloud. He stared at Harry Tempus with an odd sort of concentration. With a vengeance, James added, of which Harry didn't know was crouching next to the professor. Are you all right, sir? Barton waved her away. Fine, he mumbled, his breath still heavy and his words distorted with a windy hiss. The defense professor made it to his feet, standing with a tense posture and staring at Harry. "You did warn me," the man finally said. Some of his color had come back in his face. "Class, you've just seen that it is indeed possible to break the Imperious curse. Your classmate did so." He hobbled to his desk and took a seat in the chair. Once again he took his parchment and began writing, pausing every once in a while to rub his chest. Lily and Madame Pomfrey soon entered. Professor Barton seemed to sigh in frustration. "I'm fine, madam," he claimed harshly. The nurse took in his posture and thought otherwise. "What have you been doing?" she chastised. "Class dismissed," Barton decreed. The students stared at him stupidly. They still had a half-hour of lesson left. "Get out," the Aurora ordered. Madame Pomfrey waited somewhat impatiently while the students quickly gathered their bags and scurried from the class. Professor Barton's glare was enough to put fire to their heels. As the door was swinging shut, the stragglers managed to hear 2 broken ribs. "What have you been playing at?" The irate nurse's words were quickly deafened by the door, which was too bad, as the marauders had purposely let themselves fall behind in hopes that they might hear a little more. James turned to his friends with a somewhat excited smile. "That was pretty amazing, eh?" "He assaulted a professor," Remus said. His tone implied how unprepared he was for what he had just seen. He'd never have thought it of Harry Tempest. The boy seemed so genial. Mind it didn't seem intentional. But Remus was still busy processing what he'd seen. James waved his hands at his prefect friend. "Details, anyway it wasn't on purpose and he did warn him, didn't he? Although how do you reckon he did it? I mean he managed to break an unforgivable curse. Do you know how dark that magic is? And he not only did that, he nearly took out the person who cast it on him. No one had anything to say to that. Hey, where did he go?" James looked around. The 3 marauders, along with the other Gryffindors, were headed back to the common room. Lily was up ahead walking beside Alice, but Harry Tempest was nowhere in sight. Harry stared at the flickering flames with an angry expression still on his face. He wasn't worried about Barton. The man would be fine. And Dumbledore would make certain that one hassled him too much. It didn't even matter that everyone had seen the display. Dumbledore had mentioned a forgetting potion for when he left. No doubt he'd only be a vague recollection for the students of this time. Not even worth noting. But he was angry about how his magic had responded. It was his magic, wasn't it? It belonged to him. Yet he'd had no control over the backlash that had knocked into the professor. He'd merely wanted to break through the curse like he always did. It had been the overabundance of magic that rested in his core that decided to strike back. Did this have something to do with the nature of the magic? The wards that had smashed into him were devised for defense. Did that mean his magic now reacted badly if anyone attacked him? Not a bad thing considering his history. But the lack of control still bothered him. Meditate. Mediate. Harry looked at the fire and tried to ease his magic back under his control. He'd discovered over the summer that staring at the flames seemed to be his best method for calming whatever lay within him. Some people imagined waves on a beach, other people listened to music or envisioned a beautiful garden. None of those normal methods worked. Firstly, Harry had never been taken to the beach for holiday. His only memory of the sea had been when the Dursleys had dragged him to the hut on the rock in an attempt to hide him from the magical world. It was hardly soothing, and the only water he could ever picture always seemed to be steely blue and rough. As for music, Harry had never owned any tapes of CDs. He did remember Dudley chucking his new CD player at him once. He'd gotten on hell of a black eye. In the wizarding world, Harry's only musical experience had been at the Yule Ball. It went without saying that such an event was unusable for mediation. And gardens. Well, gardens made him think of weeding. It made him think of being 8 years old and locked out of the house on a hot day, weeding his aunt's garden on the chance that she might feel inclined to provide lunch for him. But fire. There was something about it that was soothing. The flickering shapes, the warmth. He could watch it forever and forget himself in it. In the beginning he'd been a little worried that this was how people became pyromaniacs. But he hadn't felt tempted to set anything on fire, yet, so he'd decided to continue. Not that meditation helped. Utterly pointless. Sure, it was relaxing for a bit, but once he stopped, the magic was still there, still overflowing and in need of use. But he'd promised Dumbledore and Madame Pomfrey that he'd give it a try. So whenever he felt his magic becoming restless, he'd attempt once again to soothe it in this manner. And when that method failed, he moved on to the one that worked. He'd had enough of staring at fire. Rising to his feet, Harry looked around to the room that he'd chosen. The room of requirement would always feel like a safe haven to him, not matter what time he had stumbled on. He'd manipulated the room into one he was comfortable with. In many respects it resembled the D.A.S. meeting room. He'd long ago discovered that the room could devise almost anything he could think of, which was why he grinned as a familiar blank-faced dummy appeared before him. The device was one of his own imagining, an agile opponent that he could blast to smithereens if need be. It could also cast spells of a sort. Nothing creative, but the lights it issued left a sharp sting if they touched him. Harry bowed politely, his dueling dummy bowed back. Had anyone paid much attention to the empty corridor on the 7th floor, they might have noticed some mysteriously loud bangs and clashes. The one first year who had gotten lost and accidentally stumbled upon it was quick to leave. However, after a few hours the noise subsided and a somewhat weary Harry emerged. He was sweaty and his robes were casually tossed over his shoulder, standing only in his shirt and pants. However, despite the obvious physical exertion, Harry seemed very relaxed and peaceful. He glanced at his watch, noticing that he'd missed lunch, as well as the study period that Lily had been pestering him to go to. He strolled back to the common room, not worried about things anymore. Doubtlessly people would have questions regarding defense and he'd answer them as truthfully as he could. He had no intention of keeping any more secrets than necessary, as he wasn't looking forward to learning which of his parents he'd inherited his curious, investigative side. He was nearly there when he spotted an unpleasant sight. Peter Pettigrew was climbing the stairs ahead of him. However, his initial revulsion was lessened when he spotted the way the other boy was limping up the stairs, cradling his arm and whimpering in a whiny sort of way. Harry climbed the stairs at a swifter pace, falling beside the rat Animagus. "You okay, Pettigrew?" Harry asked. Peter turned in surprise. His face was a little tear-streaked and he swiftly wiped at his cheeks. "Some Slytherins jumped me," Peter tried to say, but he was slightly impeded by one of the spells that had been cast on him. The others weren't around, so Peter continued to try and climb up the stairs, but he was a sorry sight. He way limping. A few unsightly jinxes still marked him. One in particular caught Harry's eye and inspired a bad memory. Pettigrew's two front teeth were growing and were starting to extend below his collar. His nose was also a little misshaped and it almost seemed like the skin was being eaten away. "Here. Let me." Harry's expression softened at the sight of the still innocent 6th year, but he couldn't quite muster the forgiveness needed to offer him a shoulder. "Mobile corpus," he cast. Peter looked at Harry in surprise as he was weightless, lifted up, looking as if he were dangling from unseen stings. "I'll take you to the hospital wing," Harry said, trying not to look at the other boy. "I'm not certain about that thing on your nose, but a friend of mine had her teeth hit with that spell and she came back looking better than she did before," Harry said. "Thanks," Peter said sincerely. Harry felt uncomfortable with the appreciative tone and just nodded. They reached the hospital wing in silence, Harry opening the door and guiding the other boy through. Madame Pomfrey was seated at her desk paging through Witch Weekly when they entered. She looked up, a flash of concern on her face. "Settle him down over here," she instructed. She paid Harry little attention while Peter was lowered to the bed. Her wand was already out, quickly evaluating the damage. "Mr. Pettigrew, what in the world happened this time?" "A sprained wrist, I see. Luckily the arm isn't broken. And some very nasty jinxes." Harry backed away, not certain if he could leave or not. He found himself staying. "Now are you going to tell me about it this time?" she asked. Her wand was already prodding him. His teeth had stopped their descent and his leg had been instantly wrapped into a splint. "Nothing, Madame Pomfrey," Peter said with a deceptive smile. Harry found he almost liked the rat better when he was lying, made it easier to hate him. It was hard to not pity him moments ago. "Nothing, yes, and then tomorrow a group of Slytherins will be in my hospital wing. And they will say that your friends attacked them, and if they'd had proof last time your friends would have been in a great deal of trouble. Now don't you think it saves us all the hassle if you'd just tell me now?" Peter hesitated for a moment. "It's really nothing, Madame Pomfrey," he said softly. "You've nothing to be ashamed of," the nurse continued. "I don't know why you seem to. I'll need a cream for that." The older matron turned and spotted Harry, who was considering making a dash for it. You're the new boy, yes?" She gave him a stern look, one which caused Harry to smile nervously. "Stay here for a moment and make sure his nose doesn't get any worse. That is a tricky spell. I may need to have Professor Slughorn brew a potion for it. What I have may have expired." The nurse bustled away and Harry found himself next to Peter Pettigrew's bed, watching the boy's pointy nose and trying not to wonder what would happen if the spell did manage to eat more of the rat's face. "Does it hurt?" Harry finally asked. He wasn't certain what he wanted the answer to be. "Not anymore." Madame Pomfrey numbed my face. As if to demonstrate, Peter lifted his good hand and poked his cheek experimentally. "Can't feel it." "Oh. So who was it?" he asked. He didn't know why he cared. Peter looked away. "Just some Slytherins. They always like to get back at me because James and Sirius are too strong. And Remus is really smart. I'm just useless." Harry didn't know what to say to that. Peter was looking upset again and Harry really didn't think he had the moral fiber to comfort the man who would betray his parents. He could spare his life, but offering concern and support was a little bit of a stretch. "Maybe you should have them teach you a shield charm," he offered. Peter managed to look even more upset. "I'm rubbish at defense." "Good," Harry thought. "Hopefully that will make it easier to catch you." Madame Pomfrey returned. "Still enough left," she claimed happily. "The potion takes a day to brew." Poor Justin Kimball had almost his entire ear eaten away before Professor Slughorn finished this batch. Why they are teaching children flesh-eating charms I'll never know. "I don't think it's part of the curriculum," Harry added. The nurse raised an eyebrow. "You are right, Mr. Tempus, isn't it?" She surveyed him with a gentler eye now. "Professor Barton in fine, he healed nicely," she mentioned with a cold tone. "Oh yeah, I'm sorry about that," Harry said, ruffling his hair. Peter stared at him. "You really do look like James," the blonde said. Harry shrugged. "I guess." Madame Pomfrey settled herself next to Peter and rubbed a thick amount of the red cream onto Peter's nose. Harry could see the flesh underneath already starting to take shape. "I've already flued your mother," the nurse added as she added more cream. Peter jerked. "No, you didn't have to." Peter squirmed. "She doesn't have to." Did Madame Pomfrey look a little sympathetic? "I'm sorry, Mr. Pettigrew. She spoke to me last time and had me make a note to inform her if you were injured again." Peter looked terribly uncomfortable. He caught sight of Harry and the feeling seemed to increase. "Ah, you can head back to the common room now," he seemed to urge. "I'm fine. You can let the others know I'm okay. I bet they're worried." Peter seemed to calm somewhat when speaking about his friends, and a warm gleam appeared in his eye. "Sure," Harry agreed. He nodded to the Meadowitch and turned to leave, but he was ambushed by a shorter blonde woman in glasses. In her haste she spun him around but didn't stop to apologize. He should have left, but for some reason felt a desire to stay. Harry watched as she approached Peter's bed, her hands wringing on a pink handkerchief. "Oh Peter," she cried. Her voice was somewhat high-pitched and panicky. "Are you all right? Oh darling, you worry me so much. Why do you have to worry me so much? I've told you time and time again you have to take better care of yourself. I've already lost you, father. It would just kill me if I lost you too." She was patting his head and giving agonized looks at his nose. "That isn't going to be permanent, is it?" she asked the nurse, pointing at her son's nose in the disgusted manner. "No, he'll be fine." A light. "That's a relief." "Peter, why do you let these things happen? You worry me so much." Harry ducked out, closing the door to the hospital wing and muffling the noise behind him. Harry found himself wondering about Peter Pettigrew. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. He'd much rather continue to see the rat as he had. But life seemed to have a quirky sense of humor. Harry gave the password to the fat lady and climbed through the portrait hole. His entrance sparked a great deal of muttering. Apparently the show he had put on in defense had quickly spread through the Hogwarts grapevine. But no one was approaching him and Harry was comfortable with stares. He did spot the three marauders gathered by the fireplace and moved in their direction. Remus was reading, per usual for the bookish future professor. Sirius was guiding a paper airplane that was buzzing around some girl's head. James was watching his friend's progress, laughing when the girl tried to swat the airborne pest. "Hey," he said by way of greeting. Harry couldn't help but notice that unlike Peter's prediction, the three didn't seem worried about their stray friend. Harry wasn't certain what that meant. James looked up with a grin. "Hey Harry, that was some show in defense. No wonder it's your best subject." Harry shrugged. "Yeah, it's not really a big deal." The others looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You attacked a teacher," Remus hissed, his voice a little concerned. "Not badly," Harry argued. James laughed. "Well, it was awesome and you got us out of class a half hour early." Sirius hadn't made a comment and was only watching Harry thoughtfully. Anyway, I wanted to tell you that Peter is in the hospital wing, Harry informed them. What? James leaned forward in his chair. What happened? What did you do? Sirius growled. Harry couldn't help but be annoyed by the accusation. I found him limping up the stairs and took him to hospital wing. He glared at the offending animagus as he spoke. And if you want to blame anyone, you should turn that finger around. The Slytherins targeted him to get back at you for that ridiculous prank you had to play. Sirius flinched back, but then his face grew red. Those slimy Slytherins, I knew it. How is he? Remus finally asked, being the first to check on Peter's welfare. Harry couldn't help but note that while everyone was angry, no one seemed very surprised. He's fine, Madame Pomfrey is fixing him up. We should go see him, James said. He rose to his feet. Yeah, find out who it was. Sirius gritted his teeth and clenched his fist. You really don't get it, Harry said sadly. What? James asked. Harry just shook his head and headed for the dormitory. He felt like getting out of the clothes he had trained in and into a cleaner pair. He didn't watch as the three marauders hurried from the common room. In his own time he'd had his disagreements with the Slytherins. Name-calling, a strict rivalry on game day, Malfoy's constant taunting. But things had never become a feud, not one where he and his friends were in danger if they were left alone. Even in fourth year, when tempers were high and the Slytherins were running around handing out Potter stinks badges, he had rarely come to blows, and never in such a coordinated attack. Was the tension in this time impacted by the war and Voldemort, or was it all triggered by James and Sirius's own attacks against the House of Snakes? Where were you? A voice intruded into his thoughts. Harry looked up, mildly surprised to see he had arrived in the Great Hall and was seated at the Gryffindor section. Lily was sitting across from him, her eyes a chilly green. Needed to blow off some steam, he answered honestly, and I didn't really want to face all the questions. Lily seemed slightly appeased. Well, there are questions. Everyone seems to think you're a really powerful wizard, and you've leapt to the top of Hogwarts gossip. She seemed a little disapproving. Joy, was his sarcastic reply. How did you do that? Lily asked. She was lazily filling her own plate as she asked. I've had practice, Harry stated. Lily choked on the pumpkin juice she had just swallowed. Thankfully she didn't succumb to comic license and spray him in the face. What? She managed to say with a raw throat. At my school, Harry answered. We covered the unforgivables in my fourth year. Wow, Lily said, sounding very impressed. You know, I'm starting to think Spellix must be an amazing school. It has its strong points, Harry admitted, thinking back to his time. Lily examined his expression. Do you miss it? She asked. Harry took her question seriously. How much did he miss? He wasn't famous here, which was a relief. But he'd also managed to build a family of sorts in his own time. Ron, Hermione, the Weasleys. It was ironic that he had his real parents before him and yet was somehow even more of an orphan. I miss my friends, Harry replied. I never thought of that, Lily said thoughtfully. Harry divided his plate into sections, once again choosing a big dessert and a small amount of actual food. I can't believe that is how you eat, Lily said with a frown. It's utterly unfair. If I ate like that I'd weigh 300 pounds and you're skinny as a twig. I'm not skinny as a twig, Harry argued. He proved his point by flashing a few muscles and grin that was frighteningly like James Potter's. Lily chuckled, which wasn't comforting. You should at least eat healthy food, Lily pressed on. I don't know, Miss Evans, another voice entered into the conversation. That meal looks excellent. I think I'll have the same, and maybe a wedge of that chocolate cake. There is chocolate cake. Harry peered further down the table. Oi, pass that this way, Harry called down the table. To his utter surprise it worked. Good eye, Professor, Harry added looking up at the headmaster. Anytime, Mr. Tempest. I was hoping we might have a word after dinner, in my office. Harry nodded agreeably. Sure, Professor. Don't forget your own dessert, Miss Evans, the tall wizard advised seriously. Yes, sir, Professor Dumbledore, Lily agreed with a nervous smile. The headmaster nodded pleasantly before continuing his stroll to the staff table. Oh no, you're gonna be in trouble about defense today. Lily raised her hands and started tapping her mouth in a nervous gesture. I don't think he'll expel you. Calm down, Harry. She hastily reached out to pat his arm, knocking his fork from his hand. Surely it was an accident and you did warn the professor, and it's not as if he was hurt too badly. And it really isn't your fault. I mean, how can we be expected to predict how we'll respond to dark magic that had been banned by the ministry? Okay, just relax, Harry. Dumbledore is a fair man, he'll consider all the issues. Maybe you'll only be suspended. I don't remember what the punishment is for harming a professor. I never thought it would come up, but Harry allowed her to rant, finding the entire thing amusing. However, when he started laughing, Lily seemed to catch on. Sorry, Harry said, trying to turn the laugh into a cough. It's just you should see your face. This isn't a joke, Lily said, her heart-like face taking on a sharp look. You've been called to the headmaster's office. Usually they just send people to their head of house. Harry shrugged. Yeah, but nothing I do can change it, right? And Professor Dumbledore seems like a nice bloke. Sure, everything will be fine. Lily seemed a little outraged with casually calling the headmaster nice bloke, but she let it slide. Peering at his curiously, she stated, aren't I the one supposed to be telling you that? No one's died, Lily. It's really not that big of a deal. I suppose that is one way of looking at it, she allowed. The pair continued their dinner, later joined by Alice and Frank, as well as a classmate of Frank's who wanted to know how Harry had bested the Imperius Curse. Harry gave the man his same answer he'd given Lily and prompted the conversation in another direction. But soon the meal was over and Harry had seen Dumbledore leave the staff table a few moments before. I'll see you in the common room, Harry said. Do you know the way to the headmaster's office? Lily asked. Harry nodded, turning to leave with a steady step. The fact that he wasn't even nervous about meeting with Dumbledore made the others glance at each other. He must be powerful, Frank's friend Ethan said with a distinct tone of awe in his voice, which made Lily glance heavenward in annoyance. He explained to you that he already learned about the Unforgivables before, Lily said. She wasn't a fan of Ethan's revered tone. Lily, most auras can't beat the Imperius Curse, Frank added. It's also the way he is with Dumbledore, Ethan argued. It's like he isn't. Ethan couldn't seem to find the words to complete his sentence. I'll admit he doesn't seem to show the proper respect, Lily said with a frown. Alice reached over and swung at Lily's head. You know, for someone so smart you can be pretty dumb at times. What? Lily asked. Never mind, the blonde dismissed. But hey, you've been spending a lot of time with the new kid. Alice smiled and raised her eyebrows suggestively. I've been showing him around, Lily groaned. Don't start acting like Black and Potter. Alice was affronted. Don't compare me to them, she said, an uppity tone to her voice and her nose in the air. I just wondered if you might be starting to think of getting a boyfriend of your own. Oh goodness, Lily shook her head. I don't want a boyfriend, did you ever think of that? Maybe I want to focus on my studies. There is plenty of time for dating when I'm older. Alice gazed at her friend but wasn't particularly surprised by the statement. Yeah, well, someday you might change your mind. Lily flipped her hair over her shoulder. I think not. In the headmaster's office none of the students' fears were realized. Dumbledore had complimented Harry on his ability to break an unforgivable, and his assured that Professor Barton was fine and held no ill will. Indeed, the defense professor had asked if Harry could share how he'd managed to break the curse with his class. I don't know about that, Professor, Harry said a little sheepishly. Won't that just make me stand out more? Dumbledore grew thoughtful. Perhaps, the old man conceded. But I feel some students might benefit greatly from your skill. This time it was Harry who grew thoughtful. I'll think on it, Professor. Good, now on to other matters. How are you faring? I am curious what it is like to travel so near in time. Harry scratched his head. It does make you wonder about things, Harry said with a tinge of gloom to his voice. Dumbledore grew still. Sometimes seeing the whole picture, Mr. Potter, is a hard thing to bear. But it is only by seeing the truth, and knowing its many dimensions, that we are able to see what is right. Harry nodded. Dumbledore was still as cryptic as ever. Well, good night, Mr. Potter. And if I were you I wouldn't worry about your newfound obsession for sweets. Professor? Harry asked, a little confused about the change in topic. There is a great deal of magic about you, Harry Potter. I myself have found that having a sugary snack handy helps to wear that burden a little better. Harry wasn't really any more clear on what the headmaster was saying, but he nodded regardless. Thanks, Professor. Night. Harry crossed to the stairs and closed the door behind him. Albus Dumbledore had watched the boys retreating back with an odd sense of hope, one which he knew he didn't yet have the right to feel. The corridors were still mostly empty. Students were likely either still at dinner or perhaps in the library finishing up any work before curfew. Harry pondered what he wanted to do with his evening. He wasn't planning on putting much effort into his homework. He'd complete Professor Barton's essay from memory. Seeing as he was probably the only person alive to have experienced all three unforgivables gave him a slight advantage. Harry breathed a sigh of relief. Just a few more hours and this Thursday would be over. All considering, it hadn't been the worst one he could remember. A hand snaked out and gripped his robes with a surprising firm grip. Harry was yanked off his feet and found himself being dragged to the left and into a spare classroom. He'd spoke too soon. Harry found himself staggering trying to stay on his feet. But he managed it. The grip had let him go and Harry found himself able to look up at his attacker. Sirius Black stood in the shadows of the classroom. The sun had set already but a faint glow of light allowed the young pureblood's features to stand in sharp contrast. Sirius. Harry found himself saying, forgetting that here, in this time, he wasn't exactly friends with the young man. I don't like you, Sirius said. Harry raised an eyebrow. Yeah, they weren't friends. So what did you bring me here for? Harry found himself unconsciously tensing, watching the man's hands to make sure he didn't raise a wand. This level of alertness made him feel sick. He didn't want to have to fight his godfather. Sirius' eyes looked black in the dark. And as the silence dragged on, Harry found himself feeling somewhat concerned. Not for himself, but for the wizard before him. There was something about this Sirius, something that reminded Harry of another man. A man who had endured years in the wizarding prison of Azkaban, a man who was desperate and hollow, a man who should have no resemblance to the prankster before him. I need your help.